Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exegetically Speaking, the podcast of the friends and faculty of Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, and the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. My name is David Capes, and I am the Senior Research Fellow at the library and also former faculty member up at Wheaton College. Our purpose in these podcasts is simple. We want to promote the study of biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, so that we could read the Bible more faithfully, study it more fully, and not just read it and study it, but also to live it. Joining me today is Dr. Nijay Gupta, Professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary in suburban Chicago, Illinois. Nijay, welcome.
Hi, David. Thanks so much. Long-time listener. I appreciate being here.
Hey, thanks. We've been excited to know that you're coming our way, and we're going to talk about, in another podcast that we'll be referencing about your book, Paul and the Language of Faith. But today we're going to be looking together on this podcast, Exegetically Speaking, at one of my favorite passages, the Philippian hymn, as it's called, or Carmen Christi,
That's right.
as the old Ralph Martin book. So tell us a little bit about what struck you about this and why you think it's something we need to dive into.
Thanks, David. Yeah, as you kind of implied, this is one of the most famous passages in the New Testament for its content, what it says about Jesus Christ, but also scholars have noted when they read the Greek text that it's really beautifully written in Greek. Sometimes scholars have wondered, did this predate Paul? Was this part of primitive Christianity? Did Paul pick this up from a church service or from kind of an early hymn book? But what we do know is that the language, the Greek language in this text fits really well into Paul's message in Philippians as a whole about shaping your mind towards being like the humble Christ who gave his life for us.
My friend Larry Hurtado used to say that this hymn is all about showing Jesus as a lordly example for life.
Yeah, that's
right?
that's beautifully put, because that language is right there in the text about Jesus as Kurios, Lord.
Yeah. So I mean, it is poetry, right? I mean, some translations you look at it and it's not translated like poetry. I mean, every verse is like a paragraph, and so you miss that part. But there is, in fact, Greek poetry here, right?
You know, poetry is so hard to define. What exactly is a poem? It's kind of like one of those things where
Yeah.
you know it when you see it. What I will say is that it's beautifully constructed. There's been a lot of thoughtfulness. There are a lot of things in Paul's letters that are really thoughtfully and beautifully constructed. Whether or not it's a poem, scholars love to argue about that. Is it a hymn? Is it a poem? I like to call it Ode to Christ. And that gets us into that mode of viewing it as kind of lyrical. And it does have that quality for sure.
Are there any particular phrases that stand out to you in the text?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me give you a few things that I really love about this passage in Greek. So it begins with this idea, have this mindset, tuta phroneta, and that verb, phroneo, means, it doesn't just mean to think. It's the closest we get in the ancient world to worldview, mind orientation, or mindset. So shape the way your mind looks at something, your mind's eye, in a particular way. This is one of those rare words that really gets us into that kind of imagery of what we might think of as worldview. So right from the start, you know what you're doing with this passage. Have this mindset in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Then we get into verse 6, which is the first verse of this ode, who in the form of God, being in the form of God. This word form is really important, David, because scholars have argued for centuries over what this means. Is it nature? What does it refer to? I agree with those scholars that say it really has to do with outward appearance. Now, that seems kind of strange to talk about because God's invisible. But what it's really talking about, I think, is the glory of God. We think today about showing off your glory with bling, jewelry or clothing. Well, this kind of almost makes it seem like Jesus had a lot of bling when he was in heaven in his pre-incarnate state. And this is
I've never heard it put
up.
exactly that way.
Well, I want to give you something special for your listeners here. Jesus had Jesus glory
great.
Bling in his heavenly
He had
state.
bling.
Yeah, and he was willing to give that up. I'll mention a couple other things, then we can go back and forth. But there's a couple repetitions here really important about when Jesus gives things up. It says he emptied himself, and then it says he tapenao, he humbled or lowered himself. There's a repetition of a key word here, which which is heauton, which means self. So emptying and humbling in the ancient world were things you never did to yourself. They were things that other people do to you. So if I were listening to this in Greek, reading it in Greek in the first century, what would stand out to me was not just kenao, emptied himself, not just tapaneo, humbled himself, but heoton, humbled himself. Jesus did things to himself that people never dreamed about in their whole lives would happen to them. Yet he
Mm.
was willing to do that. So you have that impression of Jesus's will, Jesus's obedience, Jesus's self-sacrifice. The idea of him doing it to
Yeah.
himself is our model. He's willing to do the hard stuff as a choice to bring such great things for our benefit.
Seems to me that that really comports with what John is saying. Is that, you know, in John's gospel, Jesus seems to be really be in control, right?
Yeah.
Nobody takes my life from me; I lay it down.
That's
right.
right.
There's a kind of a different cast there, and Paul seems to be, in a way, agreeing with that this is something Jesus did to himself. I like the way you put that.
Yeah, and what's incredible then is that changeover that happens once we get to verse 9. Dia, therefore, you have a big kind of turning of the page, transition from the dark parts of this
Mm.
hymn or ode to kind of the what Tolkien called eucatastrophe. How is something so horrible undone? It's
Mm.
undone with this therefore, and it says God, hupsao, highly exalted. So not just exalted, hupsao, but hupsao. You might even want to say skyrocket or catapulted him. So no matter
Yeah.
how low Jesus went in his humility to being like a slave or to dying on a cross, which is as low as you could get, he gets catapulted, skyrocketed, and then he's
Mm.
given charizo, he's given the gift of this name above, again, the language of above, huper, above any name. What I love about, many scholars point out about this hymn or ode, is this idea of a V-shaped pattern, this high glory, and then this subjection, self-imposed subjection, but then this super exaltation. And you know, David, the key message we get from this hymn is God can overcome any difficult thing that we're going through and bring us out even higher level, but it requires faith, it requires trust. And Jesus is our example. God doesn't promise to put us through anything he hasn't already put his son, Jesus Christ, through.
EJ, that's a great message. Thanks so much for being with us today here on Exegetically Speaking.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Thanks as well to Silvio Vasquez, Rebecca Larson, and Kristen Sanchez for helping us edit and produce the podcast. Thanks to Phil Keke for our music. If you want to study biblical languages, you ought to consider Wheaton College, whether you're a graduate or undergraduate student. Go to the website, www.wheaton.edu, and look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. If you have questions about this podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Comments, again, love to hear from you. Contact us at exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for listening.